All right, Deependra, welcome to Cassandra. Thank you so much for taking the time.
My pleasure to be here with you.
Deependra, for the few listeners that don't know yet who you are, haven't checked out your profile yet, do you want to give us a short version of your decades of experience, and how all of this came together?
So Arvind, I'm basically an infantry officer from the Indian Army, and I spent 40 years in the Army, serving in almost all the border areas, also in a United Nations mission. But primarily, the focus of the areas that I've served were largely sort of counter infiltration, counter terrorism, counter insurgency kind of operation. And I finally retired as the Army commander of the Indian Army's Northern Command. And the Indian Army's Northern Command looks after Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh, where the current situation is now happening. So I spent about 2.5 years as the Army commander of Northern Command. After my retirement, I've set up a think tank. It's called the Council for Strategic and Defense Research at Delhi. And I'm also a senior fellow with the Delhi Policy Group, which is another think tank based out of Delhi. And I do, a lot of writing in strategic journals, in newspapers, professional journals. So, I mean, that's how I keep myself busy after my retirement.
Well deserved for sure. So, and you're still, watching everything very closely. And over the decades, things, have changed a lot, right? When we talk about an Indian security strategy, do you want to take us back a little bit, at the point of your choosing, how you observe this change, and what do you see the features of this major change in India's strategy here?
So, Arvind, let's start from the turn of the century. I think 23 years back is a good time to start. And that time, largely, the Indian military strategic focus was on Pakistan. Because since independence, we had fought 3 wars with Pakistan. 1999, just before the turn of the century, we had fought another war with Pakistan at Kargil. The insurgency in Jammu and Kashmir at that time was very, very heated, and there was infiltration that was coming from Pakistan. So, as I said, the focus at the turn of the century was towards Pakistan. But I think slowly over the next decade, we also started looking at the developments that are taking place along our northern borders. Massive infrastructure development was happening with China. Tibet, road development, railway lines were coming up. And of course, we had an unsettled border with China. I mean, the whole border is actually neither delineated nor demarcated. And it's an unsettled border. And so I think by about 2009-10, we see some attention sort of moving towards the northern borders along the line of actual control, as we call it, and to start focusing a little more on China. And so that's the time when you see some not only infrastructure improvements, but also raisings of additional military forces for that border. But of course, the real turning point has come in 2020. And that's when, we saw very large major movements by PLA along the western border in Ladakh. And we are seeing since then, there's an ongoing standoff, a sort of a stalemate that is going on between Indian and PLA soldiers. There is talk about almost 60,000 troops on either side having got deployed along the line of actual control. So slowly now, I think the focus really has shifted from a military security perspective towards what we see is a greater challenge from China. And of course, that's also because what you're seeing in Pakistan today is enormous kinds of crises, political, economic, constitutional, internal security problems. So I think Pakistan is seen as a lesser of a challenge today in India as compared to China.
And like, you know, when we talk about, obviously that's the elephant in the room and everyone has it on their minds, you know, what kind of features or what are kind of like the things that this strategy kind of, you know, involves? Like, you know, we have the Quad, we have, you know, the Andaman, Nicobar Islands. There are a lot of kind of balls up in the air. So what do you see as the major pillars?
Okay, so one is, Arvind, we firmly believe that as far as your security is concerned, primarily it has to be handled by yourself. So India has to handle its challenges on its own. And broadly, there are two major challenges. The continental challenge, which is, as I said, an unsettled border. We are seeing, so prior to 2020, we were seeing something like 300 to 400 what we call LAC transgressions by the PLA. So it wasn't as if, you know, the border was quiet. Of course, there was no violence, but we were seeing an unsettled border could lead to incidents. So that's the continental challenge. And then, of course, is the maritime challenge, where now we are seeing increasing presence of PLA Navy in the Indian Ocean. And we feel at some stage, you know, India has a geographical advantage in the maritime space. And so could that be getting diluted? So these are two sort of primary pillars of how to handle both the continental and the maritime challenge. And I think India is also conscious that in the future, if you want to meet the challenge posed by China, you need to have partnerships with like-minded countries.
Right.
And that is where you know, groupings like Quad come in. That's where your partnership with countries like the US, like Japan, all these come in that we have a common understanding of what a peaceful Indo-Pacific should look like. And that's the concept which sometimes is challenged by China, and therefore, so we need to come together in order to see that, you know, China's aggressiveness is countered to some extent.
So you mentioned already the 2020 as like pretty much this realization or this kind of like, you know, a shift, right? Mm-hmm. So when you now look over the next, let's say, you know, years, right? What would you expect, like, you know, from, you know, in general, like all players involved, right? Like, how would you expect the security landscape to change, right? Like, you know, what are your assumptions? Obviously, it depends on a lot of factors, you know, like there's how, like, you know, like China is behaving, how, you know, like the US and others are, you know, pushing the region or not. But like, you know, just like from your kind of, you know, experience from all these years, what do you kind of, you know, see? What do you think this is all heading?
So I see, Arvind, let me describe it as a much more sort of complex environment as we go ahead. And I say this for a few reasons. The first is, of course, you know, the rise of China. Its economic potential, its military potential, and the way that both these are growing, and China becoming more and more assertive. And we are seeing that. I'm not talking about only against the Indian borders, but also you see that in the East China Sea, the South China Sea. There is greater sort of there is greater aggressiveness that you know, we need to find our place firstly in Asia and then globally. And in Asia, we are like the dominant sort of power, and therefore, you know, that must be acknowledged. So you're seeing an aggressive sort of China on one side. On the other side, you're seeing increasingly superpower sort of competition playing out in the Indo-Pacific. So the US now sees China as, you know, main challenger to its sort of you know, global domination. And therefore, you are seeing, you know, trade wars, technology wars, freedom of navigation operations, attempts to cull together an alliance like the AUKUS, for example, has come in order to. So as opposed to the previous Cold War, which was very far away from India's border, the current, and if I could call it a Cold War, the way strategy is playing out between the US and China, it's playing out very close to India's borders. It's going to play out in the Indian Ocean. And therefore, India willy-nilly is going to be somehow, get involved in this. So the earlier concept of, non-aligned movement, and we are completely non-aligned, I think that possibly will not work.
Right.
And
so you have to lean towards one side.
Yeah. So although Indian policymakers still say we want strategic autonomy, but I'm afraid as we look into the future, willy-nilly, I think India could get drawn one side or the other.
And apart from, obviously, you mentioned already this disputed border, and where else do you see some risks, some kind of tension points, right? If you look maybe over the next 12 months or 24 months, what do you see are the risks here?
So frankly, Armin, if you look in the short term, 12 months, 24 months, I think the risks are mainly along the continental borders, along the line of actual control.
Right.
And why I say that, and these risks are not minimal. And why I say that is, I already mentioned to you that very large number of soldiers have got deployed on both sides. But compounding this problem is the fact that the confidence building measures between India and China, which held peace along the LAC, have now completely broken down. And so there is a great deal of mistrust on both sides. There is a great deal of suspicion on both sides. There is more aggressive behavior on both sides. So if you ask me over the next 1 year, 2 years, where the flashpoints will come, I think it will come on the land borders. If you look 5, 6, 7 years down the line, then maybe you will also find challenges at sea, because you'll find greater and greater presence of the PLA Navy, which happens in that area.
And you're talking to a lot of people. You're traveling from different, countries and different organizations. What's the kind of the sentiment? Maybe in a particular, in particular the Indian security community that you are meeting on a frequent basis. What's the sentiment? Is it just a sentiment of zero trust and nothing goes? It seems to be also spilling over in the business community, looking at several kind of other communities that we are talking to. So what do you see there as a sentiment indicator?
So sentiment, if you look at the public sentiment in India, has suddenly changed as far as China is concerned. So right. And it's impacting not only in the security space, but as you said, it's also impacting on the business space. So it's getting more and more difficult for China to do business in India. Companies like Huawei, for example, have been told that they cannot participate in India's 5G rollout. India is also very seriously looking at Chinese equipment in areas like information technology, communication, power sector, and saying, look, there are vulnerabilities. And of course, it's really impacted the diplomacy and bilateral relations, because while China continues to say that, look, let the border issue not affect our overall relations, right. India has very clearly said, look, it cannot be business as usual as long as you people are there at the borders, and unless you pull back and status quo is restored, we cannot get back to normal in bilateral relations. So I think it's had a very large sort of impact.
And when you in these communities, what is the most asked question that you recently hear? Maybe either directed to yourself or that is really kind of discussed. What's the kind of the pivotal thing that's on people's minds?
I think I think there is a lot of concern on whether what has happened and the sort of the ongoing standoff on the border,
Right.
can it lead to a larger conflict? I mean, that's, I think, something which is there at the back of many people's mind, including business leaders, because any kind of major conflict could actually really impact the economy of, I would say, both the countries, but maybe India more so. That's something that's always at the back of the mind. Although Armin, my answer is that, look, we don't think it will lead to an all-out war. I think there is that sense on both sides that, look, there are huge costs to war. But then in a situation like this, which I described, sometimes, things happen which you don't want to happen. So even if it's a local sort of conflict, and then it sort of spirals out of control. I mean, we've had 20 soldiers killed in June 2020. In December, January this year, there was a major sort of physical scuffle between Indian and Chinese troops at a place called Yangtze. Now, in conditions like this, when troops are grappling with each other and getting injured, I mean, sometimes there is this chance of conflict sort of spiraling out of control.
Yeah. And what are you watching these days, right? Like, what kind of events, especially in regards to China, how do you track? I think that's pretty much the question, right? How do you track the risk, right? So, okay, so there's like, if that's the biggest risk, that we have further kind of border clashes and so on and so forth. And, obviously, I think it's always the case that I guess we have the same with China and the Philippines, where it's like just frigates, and there are loads of all of these kind of going back and forth, and it's a little bit strategic to actually flame up these conflicts from time to time, I guess, to show whatever you think. So how do you watch it? Like, what kind of signals do you watch? Is it just like, is it possible to have a lead on it or an overview, or anything that events where that would tell you, okay, so I looked at this, and therefore I think the risk is now greater or lower?
So I think one is you track troop deployments and troop strength, that where have the Chinese moved more soldiers across some area, which would give you an indication of sort of something being planned. You also track conversations and provocations. So conversations, that there is a regular system of senior officers meeting each other.
Mm-hmm.
And so if that is happening quite frequently, then people are talking to each other. If there is a big gap, for example, we recently held the 18th meeting. There was almost a 4-5 month gap between the 17th and 18th meeting. So how much conversation is going on at the ground level, politically, diplomatically? Because that's a good indicator that at least people are talking to each other. And finally, provocations, in the sense that, look, we already have a tense situation on the border. Is the Chinese military making some provocative kind of actions? I mentioned to you about this Yangtze incident.
Yes.
I mean, there is talk that almost 400 soldiers tried to sort of intrude into across the line of control into Indian area. And then they were stopped and there were physical clashes. Mm-hmm. So if you really want peace and tranquility, as they use the words, along the line of active control, should you be actually doing this kind of provocation? Or is it sort of avoidable? So these are some of the things, I think, Armin, that you look at to see how things are going. What is the possible thinking on the other side?
So when we move on to, let's say the Indian perspective from a little bit more at the global level, right? There are a lot of things going on. I think, We are more than a year in now, in the Ukraine conflict, war, whatever we want to call it. I think the Western world, or a lot of commentators, they now see, India, or there's a lot of kind of hope in whatever naive or not naive way in India's role, be it in an economic sense or like the security sense, obviously, to hedge versus China. Like, how realistic do you think are these assumptions? And the reason I'm saying that is the strategic autonomy that you just questioned before in the question. It does seem to be like quite real, like coming from Europe to a certain extent. Europe wants the same, even though like that doesn't talk with one voice at all on this matter. But how do you see India's global role here?
Okay, so Arvind, I know India did come in for some criticism, particularly from the West, on not openly sort of opposing Russia.
Right.
But frankly, and I say this, it shouldn't have come as a surprise. I mean, Russia has been a sort of a traditional supporter of India many, many years. If you recall, after 2020, what happened in Ladakh between India and China, the first meeting of the Chinese and Indian defense and foreign ministers was actually held at Moscow. So Moscow was also looked at as a place where if there is a problem between India and China, both countries could look at Moscow somewhat as a sort of an indirect kind of a mediator. India was also very highly dependent on Russia for defense supplies. So India also says, as you said, we have a strategic autonomy. So I think an outright condemnation of Russia should not have been sort of expected from India. India did say that, we want things to be resolved peacefully and talk should take place. The Prime Minister is on record as telling President Putin that this is not a need of war. So that's the sort of approach that is taken by India, and I think you will see that approach at least officially being sounded also in the future. Would India be looking at relations with Moscow, dependence on arms supply closely? I think India would be looking at that and trying, seeing that how to reduce particularly dependence on Russian equipment. And I think
why do you think that's the case? Is that just because of like for political reasons, or is it more because of like sanctions and like a replacement of maintenance? I think like these are the things that I'm reading, at least.
Yeah. So there are very practical considerations to it, and one is that already because of sanctions, etc., and because Russia itself is engaged in the war, the availability of spares, availability of upgrades,
right,
the availability of equipment that was contracted from Russia, and also somewhat, I think, critically would be looking at the performance of Russian equipment and saying it isn't good to have over dependence on one country, and therefore there is a need to diversify. So that diversification was already taking place. For example, I mean, we hardly bought any U.S. military equipment, but in the last I think 8 or 10 years. So fair amount of equipment has also come from the United States. So I think there is a practical considerations of why we are going to be looking at. Right? And you also see in Indian businesses, and particularly those businesses which have sort of like a international business also, are also very chary of the whole sanctions regime. That if we do business with Russia, we know what happens to our international companies, etc. So, as I said, I think there are practical considerations, and frankly, how Russia-China relations grow in the future, where does the dependency between these two countries on each other go? Does Russia become very weak and then become over-dependent on China? Those are also things that I think India will have to be practically looking at.
It's very interesting. Back to these, let's call them naive observers in the Western world that look at India and its, handling with Ukraine or whatever. Like, what do you think they really need to understand, right? Like, what do you think like is the key essence that like people should kind of take away when now they look at a topic like, India's military security strategy going forward? It's not to get like too confused.
So like, I think they should understand, India has its own national concerns and therefore doesn't really want to get pitched into being seen as allying with one country or the other. So you have your own concerns. Should you really get too involved in a war which is happening in Europe? And should you be picking sides? If you look at Quad, for example, I mean, India very clearly says it's not an alliance aimed at anyone. It's just a grouping of like-minded countries. Doesn't want to sort of openly say we are hostile to China or make those kind of statements. And I think the West also needs to understand that India is a developing country. There is a huge amounts of population which is below the poverty line. And so to say, don't deal with Russia on oil and on energy, I think is a bit unfair because
yes,
I think the political leadership has clearly said, look, we are a developing country. We have large number of poor people in our country. If you tell us don't buy oil at the best price you can get, I mean, that's just like, why should we be sacrificing our interest of our people for something that is happening in Europe?
Deependra, before we wrap this up and apart from Cassandra, where can people follow your work or follow you as a person?
So I have a LinkedIn account, which I also have a Twitter account. Although on the Twitter account I'm not very active, but I do have a LinkedIn account on which I generally post some of the articles, some of the pieces that I write. I normally post it on LinkedIn.
And you mentioned the think tank as well. Like any interesting projects that you are working on with the think tank these days?
So we're working on a number of projects. Primarily, so some are directly related to sort of peace and security.
Right.
We're also working on climate security, climate change. We're working with some people on social media, trying to identify hate speech and trying to see how that can be controlled. So these are 3-4 areas that we are working on. People could go to the Council for Strategic and Defense Research website. So we have our website and have a look at some of the work that we have done.
Perfect. We will link them in the show notes. Deependra, thank you so much for your time. It was an absolute pleasure. I certainly learned a lot. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Armin. Thanks, and great talking to you.